Well, good morning. Really appreciate everyone taking the time to join our session here on meeting the mandate of the Chief Supply Chain Officer. I'm Chuck Reynolds, leader in LEK's digital supply chain practice, and joined by...
Yeah, and I'm Matt Stanfield, a partner, and I lead our supply chain operations and procurement capability.
So, we're all here because the evolving marketplace for what the Chief Supply Chain Officer has to do is complex and ever-changing. And so we wanted to have a conversation, share some thoughts on that. But given the group in the room, really, please feel free to interject questions, comments, and otherwise it's a small enough group that I think we can have a conversation versus a presentation.
Yeah, so to get started, I think we can all appreciate and have awareness around global shocks, whether that's weather, economic trade wars, or even, labor strikes that create demands and impacts on the broader supply chain. In order to understand the mandate of the Chief Supply Chain Officer, we want to start with understanding what the CEOs are expecting and consequently what they're going to require from their organization. And it really starts with the elimination of the word or. CEOs expect profitable growth and resilience and sustainability running in parallel. Over 2/3 of the CEOs are expecting to alter their supply chains over the next 3 to 5 years. And I think as we progress in the conversation, you're going to see that that's a bit of a constant, and will get ever increasing from a frequency as well as a rate. And of course, AI has really underpinned what some of this ceiling raise is about. And there's an expectation that you get speed, accuracy, and of course, faster cross-functional decision-making. There continues to be disintermediation that AI is driving, in general, but we certainly see that going to take big effect on that of the Chief Supply Chain Officer. So if you kind of advance that forward and say, okay, so what does the Chief Supply Chain Officer ultimately have to drive? If you'll jump forward. Yeah, thank you. Number one is being able to deliver, that profitable growth, irrespective of the turbulence that supply chains are going to face. Whether you're in manufacturing or services, if you look at the manufacturing element, over 60% are expected to drive profitable growth in H1. And I think everyone around the room could give reasons for why that shouldn't be. That still is the expectation and that of what the Chief Supply Chain Officer has to do. You have to build resilient supply networks. Of course, there's a lot of ways to think about that. You can solve that through inventory. You can solve that through optionality through your supplier base. And you can solve that through redundant capacities and capabilities. And of course, the question is, linking that to the first one, you still have to be profitable, which means you have to be resource constrained and smart about where you place your bets in order to organize that. And whether you're in life sciences, or the semiconductor space, we've seen a majority of organizations face some form of disruption. And so that's going to be a constant that you have to design in to your supply chain calculus. And then the last element, which has been going on for decades, and I think it's one of the neat elements of supply chain where you can improve profitability while driving increased sustainability by finding ways to move freight with less miles or get better cube, driving efficiency, so where you really can serve the P&L and your overall sustainable footprint. That is an expectation too. Again, it's the elimination of or, it's and. Unfortunately, over 30% feel unprepared to start that decarbonization, and the Chief Supply Chain Officer is going to play a very critical role. Not the only role, but certainly a leading role. So if you kind of think about, stretching across what that expectation is as a brief, what does that really mean to the evolution of physical versus digital?
And I think really that's one of the interesting things in that as we think about the brief that chief supply chain officers have to meet and have to deliver, it really requires a balance of investments with the physical capital investments and the digital investments. In fact, between 2023 and 2025, we see a 10x versus a 100x growth on, or 10% increase versus 100% increase in growth versus capital expenditure in physical investments in the supply chain versus digital investments in the supply chain. And really what we're understanding is that there is this balance between how do we have to meet the mandate with just increasing the footprint, optimizing the footprint through the use of physical investments, but also operationally, how are we completely adjusting the way in which we're delivering our supply chain through the deployment of incremental data assets, incremental technology solutions that are both embedded within our physical solutions, but then also thinking about operationalizing the whole function of supply chain further and further into the other functions of the organization, from customer experience to customer service to otherwise. And that is really requiring us to layer on top of these integrated investments that are more solution-oriented versus just one-time expenditures on increasing the capital of a distribution center or a manufacturing plant. And this serves the brief in many different ways. We see it in terms of a different return profile on the capital expenditures that are being made. By reconfiguring the network, both from a physical perspective, but then also through the advancements of digital, we are seeing increased resilience and increased sustainability. We'll talk about a little bit about how that actually is manifesting in organizations today. But these things are definitely coming in concert, and we're seeing that there's an expectation that it isn't one or the other, but it is both collectively. And that is manifesting itself across the entire supply chain management process, from kind of planning to intake, to make, to deliver. All functions really require us to have embedded AI solutions and digital solutions that are built in concert with our physical assets. So, for example, in planning, we see the notion from shifting from internal four-wall data sets on forecasting to looking at the entire picture of all of the signals that are available to us to improve our forecast accuracy and specificity. No longer are retailers, for example, able to just distribute against last year's sales and the weather at 8 different regions in the U.S. We have to plan and forecast for a much, much smaller kind of unit of one for our store footprint across the entire network. And that is not able to be done by just adding capital expenditure or people expenditure to do more planning. Rather, we have to look at incremental data sets and AI solutions to augment that capability. We also look at kind of sourcing, and we look at kind of the need to reimagine how and when we are actually monitoring the entire supply chain and looking at disruptions for our vendors at tier 2 and tier 3 data signals, so that we can be more resilient and be more aware of when changes are going to happen. Again, this can't happen by adding incremental processes and flags or people to look at these items or watch a dashboard. Rather, we need to embed and reimagine processes and actually allow for autonomous decision making that adjust our entire procurement process as appropriate with the right guardrails provided. A couple of years ago, this wasn't really thought of. When we were thinking about intelligent supply chains, we thought about insight, and now we need to reconfigure to think about autonomous decisions. And from a make perspective, I think a lot of people fully appreciate the desire to embed digital manufacturing and Industry 4.0 concepts within the four walls of our manufacturing processes. But we forget that really what that unlocks is it creates a significant amount of data on quality control, on labor management, on execution processes that just produce the digital exhaust, if you will. Well, we now recognize that the investments in that Industry 4.0 and the digital factory have to then permeate much more broadly within the entire supply chain function. We have to use that data to better plan our manufacturing processes and actually deploy those insights to better autonomously adjust our planning, our manufacturing process. What lines are going to produce what in order to reduce waste, again, to achieve the sustainability goals, but also to achieve the profitable growth goals in terms of reducing downtime, reducing switching costs through truly optimized and adjusted supply chains. And that really then gets to the deliver piece, which Matt already alluded to the notion that transportation costs are fundamentally changing. Well, when you think about better management of the entire network and how we transfer and transport our goods, the cost to do so is extremely important, as is the modality in which we're going to choose to deliver. Well, when you string all of these things together, from better planning and forecasting of where and how our demand is going to need to be met, to how we're going to source and deliver those to where we're going to make it and how we're going to transport it, when you think about all of those decisions and we can make them in concert to each other, that's the unlock. And that's really where the confluence and the balance of physical investments come together with digital investments. With a unified data platform, we can think, well, if I make it here versus this other location, my transportation cost will go down because I no longer need to transfer it as far, or with truck versus train, for example. All of these decisions today are made in silos. And what AI and our digital solutions are enabling is that we can make them in an interconnected way. And that requires a completely different rethinking of our operating model. And the advent of AI has really created that. No longer can we think about linear processes independently, but we have to think about reconfiguring the decisions that are made.
So if you think about where the chief supply chain officer is positioned today, I certainly remember in my career when you were fighting just to get a seat at the table. Now you're really in a situation where you're in the driver's seat to really, change and shape some of the elements that Chuck just covered. And so as you think about what that shift is, and you go to some real traditional thinking, it really started with sweating the assets, right? Push as much productivity as you could through your physical network, absorb overhead, make sure that you have availability from an inventory standpoint. And now you really want to shift that mindset to designing adaptive and learning systems. And so that really means make your supply chain not a static system, but one that changes decisions, changes production rates, changes inventory allocations to different geographies, is able to detect end customer requirements that may shift from one SKU to the other. You have to be able to solve all of those in order to, one, secure your top line, and then make sure that you really protect that profitability. Additionally, as you think about how do you move from a a command and control kind of environment, which, is really filled with plenty of KPIs and very rigid guidelines and principles of, the manufacturing system will, or the supply chain organization should. It's really about turning into more of an orchestrator, and that's empowering squads or groups within the companies that are built cross-functionally, and have them accelerate some of that AI tool development and deployment, certainly within elements of guardrails, but you do want to err on the side of speed. The faster you enable this adaptive system, the better off you're going to be. And then shifting from the mindset of cost first. I spent over a decade of my career in leading procurement organizations, and every year it was, what percentage are you going to save? And that's certainly interesting, but it's not the only element to driving profitability. You got to think about this again with the end of how do you drive profitable growth, which means making sure that the higher margin SKUs are available when the customers want to buy it in the right place, as well as cost. But you have to have those service levels. You can have it, but not be able to compete from a timing standpoint, you still lose. You have to have agility. Cost will always be there, and you still need to understand what that sustainability element is. And you got to pull those together into a balanced equation. That's where the chief supply chain officer really moves to that orchestrator role that I just mentioned. And so what does that really mean as you start thinking about inside the four walls or inside the broader supply chain? Chuck and I do this a lot, but we're seeing digital twins inside of companies, whether it's a manufacturing unit or the end-to-end supply chain, taking on bigger and bigger roles above and beyond just simulating what could happen, but running scenarios, making recommendations so that it can think for you, and you elevate yourself to more of I'm going to interact with my options and understand the impacts and benefits to the business versus your traditional, I'm just going to run a lot of productivity programs year over year. And so that it elevates the decision making that you can make, and of course it also increases the speed in which you can take decisions. And so a couple of examples of some of these adaptations and what is it ultimately driven. The first example on the left-hand side was deploying a touchless planning for a European manufacturer. And this is, again, connecting the end-to-end, having digital twins, having an AI capability that can drive some of that scenario building, decision making, connecting demand signals for 70 different end countries, across hundreds of SKUs. This specifically is a dialysis machine manufacturing company. Post the implementation, we went from a heavily manual SIOP-driven process with individual country leaders, so 70 different points of input, into a centralized machine, effectively thinking through this for what's right. It's able to shift with changes in hospital systems and kidney care systems, and the impact was twofold. One, a significant reduction in inventory. So liberated some working capital. Of course, you also liberate space, which lets you rethink what the network you really need. And a significantly more than 10-point improvement on forecast accuracy, which means you then have the right SKUs and the right locations in order to sell to your customers.
And I think as we look at the second example, this was a distributor, and the entire network needed to be reconfigured. As you can see in the graph, I don't think you appreciate just the amount of transportation and node and transfers that were going on within this particular network. The original ask was really, hey, can you help us optimize our network with a replanning effort? And we came in, we said, look, that is great, but that is question number one. You really need to rethink how you are orchestrating and deploying the network in order to get the right highest margin products that are in demand into the right nodes of your particular distribution centers. And by doing that, we greatly reduce both the cost to transport, but also improve the sell-through for this particular distribution business. And that was coupled with a one-time reset on the entire network and reconfiguring, but also establishing an AI-driven decision pathway that said, look, here's what we can open up in terms of reconfiguring and creating a more adaptive network. Here is how the network needs to change as demand signals are changing. This was step one, which actually then unlocked a capability within the organization. They saw the benefit of embedding AI and decisioning into this one particular part of the overall business, and they said that that is making suboptimal decisions at other parts of the business. They still had inter-node transfers within the network. They still were repurchasing based on lines on a floor versus actual managed inventory and demand signals in certain cases. And so this then led to, we need to reconfigure the entire front end of our business in order to take advantage of the incremental insights that we're getting. So here's an example where the chief supply chain officer was the catalyst for a much broader digital transformation that unlocked incremental growth, that said we can better serve our customers with an improved experience that starts with the product and then extends into our confidence on delivering digital commerce, self-service ordering, and enhanced solutions that accompany the product itself. So it was an example that I think opened the eyes of this very traditional distribution business to one where they recognized that independent data-driven decisions can only get us so far. But the chief supply chain officer was able to prove that point and the capability more broadly in the organization. Yeah, please, go ahead. Yeah, interject, please.
When you think about the mandate to deliver profitable growth and the investment required for building a digital twin that could be sizable depending on the complexity of the network, the level of granularity you want to go, what's sort of the unlock there in getting a chief supply chain officer to want to commit the money to invest in building a digital twin in that profitable mindset? Do you generally just pick, supply chain only has so many KPIs, right? Or are you just thinking okay, it's either going to be variable distribution expense or inventory reduction or fixed distribution expense, and one of those is going to go down, and therefore there'll be some value somewhere to offset the cost of building this capability? Or do you try to get those specific use cases clarified enough before you can convince a chief supply chain officer to spend the money to build a digital twin?
Actually, thank you for asking that question, because that goes exactly into where we're going, in that in order to do these investments, you really have to understand what the business strategy is that's driving that. And both of these examples, or in this example, in the other example, and in fact a project that Matt and I are working on right now, they look at supply chain as a major enabler for an enhanced customer experience. Missing and selling out the product and not able to fulfill in an effective way is noticeably driving decreased demand for the organization. That was the example on the right-hand side that I talked through. It's another one that we're working on right now. And I think that when you think about where and how to invest, you need to be thinking through not the lens of what is my function controlling and owning. It is what is that going to ultimately drive, and how does that align to the business strategy overall? And that's I think builds on the point that Matt was also articulating, which is the chief supply chain officer has to have a seat at the table to the broader business organization and cannot just be around cost reduction or inventory turns alone. Those need to then ladder up into other opportunity spaces, and that's the strategic lens that we kind of bring and think about and help organizations build that ladder to say, increased inventory turns are great for, reduced working capital, but if that's the only benefit that you're thinking about, you've lost the thread on the benefit to the overall organization.
Let me share one additional thing to that exact point, which is Chuck and I had a meeting with a CEO of a very large retailer not long ago, and we were talking about digital unlocks and specifically working capital liberation because they did have a bit of an inventory problem. And he said very clearly, I don't want to reduce my inventory. I want the right inventory because I'm missing sales. And so, that's a point where the chief supply chain officer is literally going to do work that's digitally oriented across their network, not to change the dollar level, but to change what components and SKUs comprise it. And so that's back to your exact point, that's one that you would talk about. I want to create more top line revenue as a chief supply chain officer, not I'm just going to reduce cost or working capital. So
it gets back to that one team thing, right? Like
100%.
in the organization I'm in, it's like, who's the chief supply chain officer to say we're going to have more revenue? Like, he can't put that in a business case unless sales commits to it for the capability unlock and gets into this like accountable, responsible kind of.
yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that, when we bring that, our view is to bring the strategic lens to it, and that these investments they can't just be about cost reduction. And I think that when we're having a conversation with chief supply chain officers or chief growth officers or chief strategy CEOs, it is around digital twin is one tool, that's one node. I think that was really again, back to the example that we were talking about for the distribution business. They're like, hey, we need a digital twin to help us do X. And we said, that's great. That's like only a really one small part of the problem at which you are trying to solve. And we don't really think that the ROI is going to be on an improved, digital twin of your network. It's really going to be, an enhanced capability that it pushes decisions throughout the organization. And one of the things that we've continually worked with them on is that notion of digital fluency throughout the organization, and recognizing that the digital twin needs to be managed, nurtured, engaged, and deployed just like any other product in an organization, and needs to enhance and improve. So when we think about a digital supply chain, it's not just, again, the four walls. Hey, I put IoT and I've got some GoPros that are helping me manage quality effectively better than a human can. That's great, but you have to think about, what is the continuous improvement that I'm doing? How am I thinking about this as something that evolves with the capabilities? And that's a lot of the trade-offs and continued investment that comes. But with that investment comes greater return. I think I've touched on these elements in terms of, you think about, what is the overall strategy, and yet we have to play the full game board. We have to acknowledge that there are going to be lower impact items to the overall broader business, but serve a greater need. And then there will be some that are much more like a digital twin, has to be invested in, has to be built to the level of complexity that's necessary. But that then needs to link into broader investments around an intelligent supply chain that is enabled by autonomous decision making, which will likely also require a significant rework to the operating model, and rethinking how and what capabilities we need within our supply chain function, and the roles of planners, and the role of all the different kind of aspects that therein kind of use the data.
So, getting to that growth engine, thinking through the chief supply chain officer, I can appreciate the complexities of sales has to commit to it, but when you start solving the problems that people, raise as impediments to sales and growth, you can then start driving the right kind of conversation. So through the lens of the chief supply chain officer, it starts with reframing the supply chain as a profitable growth lever, not just a cost center. Yes, you'll still have to deal with costs, that's part of it. But it's not only rebranding it, it's really about driving that strategic discussion throughout the organization. Having that view of balance between digital and physical in order, from a supply chain perspective, in order to drive agility, resilience, sustainability, all in concert, is going to continue to be an important element for a chief supply chain officer. And then lastly, driving that enterprise view with a clear AI roadmap that's grounded in the corporate strategy. And I think this is something that we see too often, where a project looks neat and it's fancy and it's really interesting, but what it does is something that's contra to what the organization's trying to accomplish. And so you've got to make sure you align where you're spending your resources, how you're building and evolving your supply chain and the AI inside of it, that it drives the strategic outcomes. Again, whether that's new geographies, new products, faster service times, lower costs, higher availability, pick your strategic components, and it needs to be in support of that. It can't just be an interesting neat project. And so that's really what the mandate for a chief supply chain officer is now and will be over the next several years. So that's the core of the material. Hopefully we've been able to provide you some insights and perspectives for how to think about your role as a supply chain leader, or how to engage supply chain leaders and what to expect of them. Happy to take any additional questions or comments.
Can you talk a little bit about what you hear or see from your clients about trust in AI taking action? There's a huge, from what I've seen, there's a huge learning curve there.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so all of these things sound good, and they might sound hard, but from my experience, the harder part is having the good data
Yep.
to feed these tools and convincing people in supply chain to use the recommendations.
Yep. It's a great question. I'll give you one of my favorite examples on this point, which is planning has really exploded with the use of AI and machine learning. And I've seen a series of systems. I'm going to stay away from the specific brand, but it was recommending increased replenishment in a particular SKU, and it was around July. Well, the human was, that can't make any sense. That's like a 300% increase week over week. I'm going to make a manual adjustment down, back to your question of trust. Well, as it turns out, it was driving that demand because it was a sedative for pets around July the 4th, when fireworks and things like that. So the machine figured that out, and the humans didn't trust it. And eventually they started to realize, my accuracy and sell-through goes up the less I touch this machine. So there is certainly an element of fear, uncertainty, and doubt that supply chain leaders are going to go through, but you have to put it in practice and you have to measure it and do a bit of an A/B before and after, and you do have to coach your folks on, you have to trust it.
Yeah.
But it is based on the other point that you raised, which is if you don't spend the time to go through the digital and master data management cleanup, it will be a disaster.
My team does statistical forecasting, and there's a bunch of products that our staff forecast has been more accurate than our consensus demand plan for over 6 months in a row, and we cannot get the demand planners to use this.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, I think, yeah.
Like, when it's better, like the accuracy's not there, can you show us? And I was like, I don't know what else to tell you. Like,
Yeah.
we're higher than your, planner's adjustments are taking you down 6 months in a row on a set of products. Like,
You said the data is the biggest challenge in terms of AI. I'd actually say, and the way when we work with our clients, the biggest challenge is the human adoption and the change of the processes and execution there. It's almost, 75% of the effort needs to go into adoption and deployment and execution. 15% is getting the data right, and then the remaining 10 is the technology, which is, as a technologist, it pains me to tell you that is the easiest part of any project that we work on. And there are plenty of examples where even in organizations that trust data, like Amazon, for example, had people overriding decisions around merchandising, pricing, and other aspects of the business. And they said, look, you guys are overriding it 80% of the time, and you are wrong 100% of the time you override the system. So we're just going to turn off the controls, and you just can't override it anymore. They called that, they built the whole merchandising and pricing project was called Project Yoda. And then the project that turned it all off was called Hands Off the Wheel, which just allowed the system Yoda to make the decisions for you. But I think it's a testament to even the most advanced technologically, digitally fluent, data fluent organizations struggle with this. But I think it is something that we're ultimately going to have to come back to, because the system has better data. It has more inputs than any human could make. And we need to reconfigure our processes and our operating model to acknowledge that these capabilities are things that humans are not able to do in an effective way. And that is an adjustment in that I'm not watching, a machine press metal anymore. I actually just need to let the machine, execute the task for the outcome that I desire, and I've pointed it to. So as we think about that, we think about orchestrating changes in supply chain, driving to outcomes, and then looking at the best approach to achieve that outcome is truly an important adoption model.
So I'm curious what you're seeing in terms of the chief supply chain officers as they have the seats at the table, their ability to sort of show their value. I'm a big believer there's a strong link between resilience in supply chain and the ability to support sales and marketing, new product introductions, more aggressive campaigns, et cetera. Do you see the other functions having that appreciation for what investments in supply chain, resiliency, effectiveness, and sustainability have for the rest of the business? And if so, what are the things the chief supply chain officer are bringing to the table to convince others?
Yeah, I can take that. I think when we've been working with organizations, and what we're seeing is that to have a sales or marketing person sign up, there has to be the product in order to sit there. And I think that there's a broader appreciation that we have to deliver against the value proposition that exists. And organizations now, the leading organizations, appreciate that we have to kind of pull the entire thread of capabilities from what we promise to how we deliver it. And then if we don't, there are too many options, and switching costs are too low in many organizations, that we have to deliver against that. And so, chief supply chain officers are typically coming and saying, well, the last time, they're coming with the data and the insights. The last time we ran this campaign, you didn't sell out, or you did and you oversold, and then the wrong product was existing in the mix. So I think what we are seeing is a much more enterprise view of the data fabric that then is enabling organizations to have insight into where are we falling down, versus a kind of who's on first kind of problem was it that something we didn't achieve a growth objective.
Yeah, and just to give you another angle, and I'll go to the FMCG world. I see chief supply chain officers coming to sales, recognizing that in fast-moving consumer goods, innovation is a big thing. Whether it's a new flavor, a new touch, a new look, and I see supply chain officers saying, I can create new SKUs for you faster because I can now, through the use of a digital twin, I can plan my capacities differently. And here's how I'll run campaigns of, the larger runners, but I can create these windows to run these smaller batches and higher level of changeovers. Does that create value? And that's the kind of conversations that they're having now, versus sales saying, well, here's what I want. Well, I'll go figure it out. And going to figure it out usually means at the expense of other things. This is, I can still be efficient, and that, I think that's been a really big driver in mentality and perspective.
So you mentioned before you found the use case scenario that 80% of the time the actual user was inputting his own views in the data. Other than that type of resistance, how much resistance have you found, have you encountered before that in the implementation I can see, sadly, I can see people like hoarding data and not giving the whole information, the whole picture because of resistance to the change. Have you met a lot of resistance in your field?
Yeah, I see what I would classify as some kind of bizarre human behavior, such as, well, I know the system can plan and run the production wheel for me, but I still want to control it in an Excel spreadsheet. And I think there's some of this that's just, the human feels like I'm being disintermediated, and so the more I validate this machine, I'm invalidating, the need of my job. So I certainly see that. There's the distrust of, I didn't see how it got from data to its recommendation. There's this black box inside of it, therefore I'm not going to trust it. And people certainly resist that adoption. I don't think I can give a single example where that's not been the case initially, but it does go back to Chuck's reference around, project hands off the wheel. That's where the leadership just has to step in and just enough. You're not going to outsmart the system. You don't work 24 hours a day. It does. And then, of course, it's just a bit of a cultural change there. But I think that is one thing that's just a constant with the evolution of certainly digital and AI applications in supply chain.
And I think that it's a testament to the point that you can't just have someone implement AI and not paint a broader picture on where and how this will unlock value for the organization. If the change is just to suggest that we're going to reduce headcount, then I think you will have barriers to those pieces. But if the change is to shift capacity and create new innovation and unlock future growth, then I think you'll see a different level of change. And I think in hands off the wheel, that the example there was that team then went on and created Amazon Go. And so all those folks that were planning and merchandising, shifted their effort and attention to higher value and higher order activities. And painting that picture, I mean, we also saw it in helping another organization think through. This was in the sales and marketing function, but it's an example of what you're hitting, in that they used AI to produce basically the bid process for large deals, and that AI deployed, it reduced the need for the team by 20%, and instead of the cutting headcount for the sales team by 20% because now they could use AI to do the same thing, they actually just reallocated those resources to say, okay, now you're all on strategic accounts, and your intention is to drive incremental conversion rates for the sales process. And so it was, you're going to be doing more important things because now I've taken the low pieces out. And I think that's an example, to the fast-moving consumer goods. Again, we're going to plan better with AI so that you can all do the more exciting, interesting things of innovation and supply chain strategy and the like. Mm-hmm.
So, no AI model is perfect, and as a builder of statistical models and AI models, generally when you build it initially, that's where your fit is pretty good. But now let's say you install it in an organization and you let it run for 10 years, how do you guarantee that same algorithm that you put in several business cycles ago is still going to keep working? And comparable thing that comes to mind, it used to be a joke, I'm a professor, it's like, how many of you students updated EOQ numbers this summer? Because executives would install ERPs and they would put an EOQ in there and never update the damn things. So AI is new now, it's fashionable, how are consultants and executives and supply chain officers guaranteeing that these things aren't going to go way out into an unintended direction that they weren't built for?
So a couple of things there. Number one, I agree. No model is accurate. Some models are helpful. Secondly, if you go back to the key part that we're really trying to underscore here, which is the AI and the intelligent supply chain has to be grounded in the strategic direction of the company, and that changes. You're given the economic order quantities as an example. Well, if you base your model on bad information, it's going to drive the model to make bad decisions. And I think having the wherewithal and the strategic mindset to realize what I configured 3 years ago is now misaligned with the company's direction, that's the crucial part. And you have to continue to keep that as part of your operating model to make sure, no differently than does the organization have the right capabilities, does my AI model and intelligent supply chain also have the right capabilities based on what the company's trying to accomplish?
I think to build on that, I mean, I think the way that we talk about it is you have to deliver at the pace of digital, and the pace of digital continues to change. So if you're only implementing an AI model or an algorithm to support a decision every time you're implementing an ERP, it's not going to work. It needs to be constantly engaged, and that's an operating model and a mentality shift.
There's also ways you can code it into your AI models. Like, my team built a digital twin. I keep asking you about digital twins.
They're great, aren't they?
But
They're great.
yeah, but we put in drift monitoring and all kinds of things in the code so that if the underlying data is starting to shift, we'll pick it up so that we can then retune the model, right? Because it's going to change.
Yep.
Just a matter of when and how much.
Yeah, that's a good share.
So slightly more strategic question here. So when you look at some of these projects, you're talking about digital transformation, right? Those can be quite significant. Now, you also said that I totally agree with this. It's not just the technology shift, it's also change management. So in your experience in working with your clients, have you seen more of a change management approach of trying a pilot and getting some folks bought into it and then implementing across the company? Or have you seen this model of mandate that, okay, we've tested this, we believe this is the way to go, and the organization understands it?
Yeah, those that are most successful we see taking a dual approach, really, in that one, there is a bit of the formal strategy and top-down mandate that has defined the guardrails on which, where, and how we're going to strategically apply investments across digital, AI, supply chain nodes, et cetera, and one that opens up innovation and creates an opportunity for folks to test, pilot, deploy, and execute. And by creating that autonomy for the teams, you open up opportunities that maybe leadership hasn't seen, but you're doing it in the guardrails of the strategic priorities of the organization, and not just everyone can do or test or execute whatever they want. And so it brings more folks into the adoption curve and allows innovation in the areas that matter to the organization. The other piece is that I think a lot of times folks believe digital transformation is maybe like the last ERP implementation, which in fact was a much more rigid, we have to do it, we're going to do everything in finance or everything in supply chain, et cetera. And I think, now it's let's eat the elephant one bite at a time. I don't know the number of master data management projects we've done that are taking one portion of one data domain at a time and deploying decisions and opportunities against that, proving the value and moving on. Whereas, when I started MDM projects, it was, we're going to spend 9 months to do our definitions for every single data element down to the employee, to the unit, to the BOM, to everything. No longer is that feasible or workable. It is just kind of sequential deployments of value across the organization.
I had another question. This will relate to the example that you had given of the CPG product. But the supply chain officer in that particular case is coming and offering the opportunity to test and create new products. How does have that? I'm assuming that that would create some kind of a challenge for maybe other C-suites or other leaders who might have that function. So how have you seen that being navigated? Because now I'm taking on the role of a chief product officer, for example.
Yeah, I mean, look, these happen in ECs, executive meetings, whether it's the operating committee or the C-suite itself. And as you talk about challenges, one of the biggest challenges that any CPG faces is how do I get shelf space and how do I maintain that critical mass with my retailers. The digital is a bit of a different animal when you think about e-commerce. And that's what the supply chain officer identified was, okay, you're telling me you need more innovation, and I'm telling you by putting it into the current system, it impacts profitability. And so this was in response to that specific problem of how about I do X, I can enable this, I can protect this, but here are the resources that I need to do it. And there's also some insourcing opportunities that's happening as a consequence of this, but that wasn't the real driver here. It really is, how do we get more innovation to the retailers faster without hurting profitability, actually improving profitability? And so this very much came out of the C-suite, and it was, basically the supply chain officer saying, I'll take that challenge and help drive a solution that grows the business.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for the time and opportunity to let us disrupt your lunch. But now there's some time together.
Thank you.
It's great to see y'all.
All right.